This is the slave narrative of Josiah Henson, aka Uncle Tom. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was inspired by Josiah Henson and his life story. The book was so popular that it outsold the Bible at that time and had to be printed constantly. Although some people think that an Uncle Tom is an African American sellout, he actually rescued more than 200 enslaved people and helped many more. In the stage shows, rather than depict Uncle Tom or Josiah Henson as the man that he really was, Caucasian men distorted his character. They didn't think that Caucasians could be interested in seeing a strong black male protecting other black people and being heroic, so they depicted him as a sellout who hated his own people and would do anything to win the approval of the slave master. However, let me retell the story the accurate way and tell you who the real Josiah Henson was. This narrative was originally narrated by Josiah Henson and written by his editor, John Lobb, both seen in the picture. Because slavery was still in existence when Mr. Henderson told his story, he doesn't always use the full last names of the people that he was talking about. All right, let's begin. Josiah was born on June 15, 1789, in Charles County, Maryland, on a farm belonging to Mr. Francis N., about a mile from Port Tobacco. His mother was the property of Dr. Josiah McP., but she was hired by Mr. N., to whom his father belonged. Josiah was about 3 or 4 years old when he remembers his father coming home upset. His father's ear was cut off close to his head, and he was given 100 lashes because his father was punished under the Maryland law for beating a white man that severely assaulted his wife, Josiah's mother. His father, a man who was once a kind and pious man who had a good heart, became a hard man to control after this incident. As a result, the slave master decided to sell him, and neither Josiah or his mother ever saw him again. After Josiah's father was sold down to Alabama, the doctor returned Josiah's mother back to his own estate. His mother was reunited with her 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons, of which Josiah was the youngest of all. Dr. McP thought of Josiah as a very smart little pet. Josiah's knowledge of the Lord came from his mother, who would constantly quote a prayer, and she taught it to Josiah. One day, when the slave owner was riding his horse, he fell off and drowned in a small bed of water that wasn't even a foot deep. Due to his death, his slaves were sold to the highest bidder and taken to various parts of the country. His brothers and sisters were sold off one by one while his mother, who was holding his hand, looked on in grief and agony. Then his mother was separated from him and put up on the auction block. She was purchased by a man named Isaac R. When it was time for Josiah to be sold, his mother pushed herself through the crowd and fell at the feet of Mr. R., begging him to purchase Josiah so that she could at least have one of her children with her. She fell to his knees and clung to his knees in grief. Rather than simply turning a blind eye, he decided to kick her and punch her with violent blows until she quickly removed herself away from him. Josiah was purchased by someone else, a total stranger, and he was about 5 or 6. Whether it was from the trauma that he witnessed or experienced, or simply from some other cause, Josiah fell extremely ill, and they thought he was going to die. In an effort to try and get some return on his investment, Josiah's new slave owner sold him to the slave master of his mother for a very cheap price. Josiah was soon reunited with his mother, and although she barely had the supplies to nurse him back to health, he flourished in her care and grew up to be very strong and healthy. Josiah and his mother's slave master, Isaac R., was evil and wicked. He was a tyrant. He did not deserve to have any slaves, and he loved to make their lives difficult. His slaves had little opportunity to relax from labor. They had little food and no security for personal rights. Josiah's first job was to carry buckets of water to the men at work, to hold a horse plow used for weeding between the rows of corn, and as he grew older and taller, to take care of his master's saddle horse. Then a hoe was put in his hands, and he was soon required to do the day's work of a man. The food given from their master was cornmeal, salt, and in the summer was a little bit of buttermilk. There was a piece of land called a truck patch that was assigned to them so they could grow a few vegetables. There were 2 meals a day. The first one was at 12 o'clock noon, after laboring all morning, and the last one was when they finished working at night, and they were responsible for cooking their own meals. The only dress was of tow cloth, which for the young, and even for those who had passed the period of childhood, consisted of a single garment, something like a t-shirt but longer. reaching the ankles, and for the older ones, a pair of pantaloons or a gown, according to the sex, while some kind of round jacket or overcoat might be added in the winter, a wool hat once in 2 or 3 years for the males, and a pair of coarse shoes once a year. Their lodging was in log huts of a single small room with dirt floors, in which 10 or a dozen people, men, women, and children, might sleep, but which could not protect them from dampness and cold. There were no beds nor furniture of any description. A blanket was given for protection from the chillness of the air or the earth. In these huts they slept at night and ate during the day. The children were also born there, and the sick neglected there. Josiah grew up to be very strong, healthy, and full of energy. He could run farther and faster, wrestle longer, and jump higher than anyone else on the plantation. The other slaves thought of him as very smart and would prophesy the great things he would do in his life. When Josiah grew into a man, he was very confident, although he was a slave. He knew that he was capable and intelligent. He was a hard worker and always tried to do his best, often being the first in the field, whether hoeing, mowing, or reaping, to earn even a small kind word from his slave master in hopes of improving his condition. Josiah knew that he had so much more compassion than the slave master did, so to help himself and his fellow slaves, Josiah would sometimes steal what they needed from the slave master. The condition of the male slave was bad enough, heaven knows, but that of the female slave, compelled to perform unfit labor, sick, suffering, and bearing the burdens of her own sex, unpitied and unaided, as well as bearing the stress and toil that belonged to men, Josiah was often oppressed with a load of sympathy. And sometimes, when he saw them starved and miserable and unable to help themselves, he helped them to some of the comforts which they were denied by the slave master, and which the other male slaves were too fearful to get for them. Meat was not a part of their regular food, but his master had plenty of sheep and pigs, and sometimes he'd pick out the best one he could find in the flock or the drove, carry it about a mile or two into the woods, slaughter it, cut it up, and distribute it among the other slaves. When the white overseer was caught stealing, Josiah was promoted to superintendent of the farm work. By being kind to the slaves, they were more cheerful and they worked harder on their own. Josiah managed to raise double the crops that had ever been seen before on their plantation. There was a baker living at Georgetown, a few miles away from Mr. R's plantation, who was known as an upright Christian man. He was noted especially for hating slavery, and he would not buy slaves to run his business. He would not even hire a slave because he'd have to pay the slave master instead of the slave, so he did the work himself. He had a good reputation and occasionally served as a minister of the gospel. He preached in a neighborhood where preachers were somewhat rare at that time. One Sunday when he preached at a place 3 or 4 miles away, Josiah's mother persuaded him to ask the slave master to leave and go hear the man preach. And although such permission was not given freely, Josiah was allowed to go once. The slave master didn't scold him too much, but warned him of what would happen to him if he did not return immediately after the close of service. At this time, Josiah was about 18 years old and had never heard the gospel. The only thing he knew of a supreme being came from the limited knowledge of his mother. The service had already started when he arrived, but the preacher preached from Hebrews 2:9, that he, by the grace of God, should taste of death for every man. This was the first text of the Bible to which he had ever listened. Knowing it to be such, he never forgot it. After hearing the sermon and finding out that Jesus died for the enslaved and for the free, Josiah was overjoyed and enlightened. He then took his knowledge back to the plantation and shared it with the other slaves, often praying for and encouraging them to give them hope. On Saturdays and Sundays, Josiah's slave master would often assemble with the other white men in the neighborhood, which was like a holiday to them. The men would gamble, fight gamecocks, run horses, discuss politics, drink whiskey and brandy and water all day. Because these men knew that they could not find their way home alone, they ordered a slave to come and fetch them and take them home. Many times Josiah held his slave master on his horse when he could not hold himself in the saddle, and he walked by his side in darkness and mud from the tavern to his house. Quarrels and brawls of the most violent description were frequent consequences of these meetings, and whenever they became especially dangerous, and glasses were thrown, dirks drawn, and pistols fired, it was the duty of the slave to rush in, and each one was to drag his master from the fight and carry him home. Josiah was young, remarkably athletic and self-reliant, and he knew it. Sometimes he would elbow his way among the whites whom it would have almost been certain death for him to strike. He would seize his master and drag him out, mount him on his horse, or crowd him into his buggy with the ease with which he would handle a bag of corn. The slave master knew Josiah was doing for him what he could not do for himself, and Josiah confidently showed off his strength. On one of these occasions, when Josiah was about 19 or 20, his master got into a quarrel with his brother's overseer, who was one of the party. And in rescuing his master, Josiah was a little more rough with the crowd than usual. The white overseer fell on the floor, and very likely it was from the effects of a push from Josiah or a movement of his elbow. But the man attributed his fall to Josiah rather than the whiskey he had been drinking, and he planned vengeance at the first opportunity. About a week later, Josiah's slave master sent him on horseback a few miles away to drop off some letters. Josiah took a shortcut through a lane that was separated by gates from the high road and bound by a fence on each side. This lane passed through some of the farm owned by his master's brother, and his master's overseer was in the adjoining field with 3 Negroes when he went by. On his return, about an hour and a half afterwards, the overseer of his master's brother was sitting on the fence, but Josiah could see nothing of the black men. He rode on, unsuspicious of any trouble, but as he approached, the overseer jumped off the fence, and at the same time, 2 of the Negroes sprung up from under the bushes where they had been hiding. They stood up before him immediately in front of Josiah, while the 3rd Negro sprang over the fence just behind him. He was enclosed between what he could no longer doubt were hostile forces. The white overseer told Josiah to get off his horse and take off his jacket and shirt. When Josiah asked him why, he said because he was going to give him the cursedest flogging he ever had in his life. When Josiah asked him why, the overseer told him to be quiet. The overseer struck Josiah so hard and suddenly that he frightened the horse, who broke away and ran home. Josiah stepped into a corner of the fence and could only be approached in the front. The overseer told the black men to seize him, but they knew of Josiah's physical strength and they were hesitant. As they came within his reach, he knocked each of them down successfully. One of the men tried to trip Josiah's feet when he fell down, but Josiah kicked him in the mouth and knocked out several of his teeth, and he went away groaning. The overseer was hitting Josiah over the head with his stick at every opportunity. The stick was not heavy enough to knock Josiah down, but it did draw blood freely. Then the overseer took a 6 or 7 foot stake from the fence and struck him with his whole strength. When Josiah tried to block the blow, his right arm broke and it knocked him to the ground. The overseer hit him repeatedly until both of his shoulder blades were broken and blood gushed from his mouth. The other 2 black men begged the white overseer not to murder Josiah, so the overseer left him as he was, but he told Josiah to learn what it was to strike a white man. Well, the alarm had been raised at the house because the horse came back without its rider, and it was not long before assistants arrived to take Josiah home. Josiah suffered a lot because of this, because his arms were broken and the wounds on his head were painful. He could feel and hear the pieces of his shoulder blades grate against each other every time he breathed. No physician or surgeon was called to dress his wounds. As a matter of fact, no physician or surgeon had ever been called on the plantation for a slave. Or any other occasion whatsoever did he have any knowledge of such a thing happening in his entire neighborhood. He was attended by his master's sister as best as she could, and she had some reputation in being able to help the sick. So she splintered his arm and bound up his back as well as she knew how, and nature did the rest. It was 5 months before he could work at all, and the first time he tried to plow, a hard knock of the coulter against a stone shattered his shoulder blades again, and it gave him even more agony than it did the first time. He lost the ability to be able to raise his hands above his head. Josiah's master prosecuted Mr. L., his brother's white overseer, for abusing and maiming his slave, and when the case was tried before the magistrate, Josiah's slave master made a statement of the facts as Josiah related them here. When Mr. L. was called upon to say why he should not be fined for the offense, he simply stated, without being put on oath, that he acted in self-defense, that Josiah assaulted him, and that nothing had saved him from being killed on the spot by such a stout and strong fellow, but the unfortunate circumstance that his 3 Negroes were within call. The verdict was that Josiah's slave master paid all the costs of court, but he had the satisfaction of calling Mr. L a liar and scoundrel, and afterwards of beating him in a very thorough manner, for which he also had to pay another fine and costs. Josiah's slave master promoted him to superintendent so that he wouldn't have to pay a white man. Josiah was able to raise superior crops for him because by treating the other slaves well, the slaves worked harder and in harmony. Josiah would sometimes use the slave master's goods to supply the needs of the other slaves. However, other than that, Josiah did not cheat the slave master out of his property. He was just providing for the slaves in ways the slave master should have, and as a result, the slaves worked better because he provided the slaves with more products that they needed. There came a time when Josiah forgave the slave master for the causeless blows and injuries he had inflicted on him in childhood and youth. And Josiah was proud of the favor that the slave master began to show him and of the character and reputation that Josiah had earned by strenuous and persevering efforts. The slave master did not have the competence to attend to his own business needs. So Josiah was able to attend to those needs, but Josiah was able to raise more crops than was ever raised before on that plantation. At this point in his life, his job was to sell the produce in the neighboring markets of Washington and Georgetown, and his nickname was Cy. When he was about 22 years old, he married a very efficient and, for a slave, a very well-taught girl who belonged to a neighboring family, and she was kind and pious. He met her at the chapel he attended, and during nearly 40 years that had elapsed, he had no reason to regret the connection, but he rejoiced in it. He was grateful for it. She bore him 12 children, 8 of whom survived, and they promised to be the comfort of his declining years. When his master was 45 or older, he married a poor 18-year-old white woman. His new wife had a younger brother named Francis, who the slave master became the guardian of. Francis would often go to Josiah in tears, complaining that he did not have enough food to eat. Josiah, knowing how mean the slave master was, felt sorry for Francis and would often give him some of his own food. One day, the slave master, Isaac R., came to Josiah in tears, telling him that he was being sued by a brother-in-law and was about to lose everything. He gave Josiah a small sum, some provisions, 1 horse and wagon, and told him to take some of his slaves to his brother in Kentucky. Josiah mentioned that he did not really know how to get there, and this was during the winter in February of 1825 when Josiah was 35 years old. The slave master was insistent that Josiah carry himself and 18 of his slaves to Kentucky using a wagon. The women and children could ride part of the way, and the men were to trudge on foot the entire way. The slave master would follow suit within a couple of months. When they arrived in Wheeling, Virginia, Josiah sold the horse and wagon, bought a boat big enough for everyone, and floated down the river without any trouble, stopping every night to camp and sleep. When they passed along Ohio, they were often told they were free if they chose to be. Through Cincinnati, other African Americans begged them to stay in their towns and enjoy their freedom. Josiah was conflicted because he was a man of his word. He had always wanted freedom, but he also was fearful of the potential outcome. So he took the slave master's slaves to Kentucky and arrived in April of 1825. Josiah found that there were more advantages for preachers in Kentucky, and he could listen to both white and black preachers there. Josiah took every opportunity to learn about the Lord, and in 1828, 3 years after arriving in Kentucky, he was admitted as a preacher by the Methodist Episcopal Church. In the spring of 1828, the slave master sent news that he was unable to get his wife to accompany him to Kentucky, and as a result, he wanted all of his slaves in Kentucky sold, except Josiah and his family, and he wanted the money from the sales sent back to him in Maryland. Josiah realized that families would be split up and destroyed. The thought brought back some memories of when he was a child being sold away from his own family. There was a part of him that regretted not taking that freedom when he had the opportunity. The annual Methodist conference was held in Ohio. Josiah traveled from town to town preaching as he went. In the summer of 1828, Josiah soon became acquainted with a white man who was a Methodist preacher. The man told Josiah that he should consider purchasing himself out of slavery with the money that he had raised for preaching. Josiah wanted to go back to the slave master in Maryland to see his other family and try to buy himself out of slavery. Josiah found out that his mother had died during the 3 years that he was in Kentucky. When Josiah went back, he was well dressed when he reached the slave master in Maryland, but he could tell by the look on the slave master's face that he didn't like Josiah looking nice or having any pride. So the slave master took Josiah's pass and told him that he was going to stay in Maryland. The next morning, when the slave master went off to a meeting, Josiah told the mistress is also known as the slave master's white wife. He told the mistress that he needed his pass back because he was supposed to tend to some business in town. Not knowing the truth, the mistress handed him his pass back. Josiah knew of a debt that his slave master owed, so he offered to purchase his freedom from the slave master so the slave master could pay off this important debt. The slave master charged Josiah $450 for his freedom. Well, in today's money, that would be $1,632. It took a year of negotiations, but in March of 1829, Josiah finally received his freedom papers. Josiah's slave master promised to send his freedom papers by mail to his brother in Kentucky so that they would not get lost on Josiah's journey. However, when Josiah arrived in Kentucky, he was told that he could not get his freedom papers until he paid off the balance of what he owed the slave master, which was $650. His slave master had lied and would not allow his brother to give Josiah his own freedom papers. In time, the slave master began writing his brother in Kentucky, asking if Josiah was ready to pay the next installment for his freedom. Josiah advised that he had no money. Josiah was told that he would then need to accompany the slave master's son, Amos, to New Orleans to sell some products. Josiah believed that when he said goodbye to his wife and children, it was likely for the very last time. Since Josiah was the only black person on the boat, he learned how to steer and manage the boat well. The captain soon became blind and his eyes became inflamed. So Josiah quickly learned how to avoid snags and land the boat. Josiah became enraged at the idea that the slave master, his brother, and the slave master's son, Amos, were willing to sell him despite all the things he did to help them out and make them money. Josiah's fury raged within him so much that he could barely control it. It only became worse when he saw slaves that he recognized from Maryland, and they looked haggard, starved, and overworked. Josiah was so enraged, in fact, that when the slave master's son Amos was standing near him, he picked up an axe, getting ready to kill him. Suddenly he heard a voice ask him why he was getting ready to commit murder. Josiah said he didn't think of it as murder, but more like self-defense, because they were all willing to sell him to a place in which he could easily lose his life. Josiah knew that the slave master's son, Amos, was going to sell him. However, Amos promised to sell him to a good master and have him employed as a coachman or a house servant. Then Amos was going to dispel the boat and go back home on a steamboat. Ironically, Amos fell extremely ill and could barely raise his head. Amos begged Josiah to take care of him, so Josiah rode back to Kentucky with him on the steamboat, taking care of him the entire time. Amos's life hung by a thread for a while. It was months before Amos could even move about. After that experience, Josiah knew that he needed to escape to freedom. The slave master had increased Josiah's value because of his heroic and kind deed to his son. The slave master still planned on selling him, but for more money than before. Josiah discerned the slave master's plans. Josiah mentioned the idea of escape to his wife, but she was so fearful and did not agree with him. She knew that if they were caught, they most likely would be separated from their children and each other. In their argument, Josiah threatened to escape with all of the children except the baby and leave the baby and his wife behind. Josiah spent the whole night trying to get her to agree. When it was time for him to leave for work the next morning, she called him back to her, and with tears in her eyes, she agreed to go with him. When nightfall came, Josiah went to the big house and asked if he could take his son Tom with him so they could mend his clothes. Then Josiah went and got the rest of his family, and they had a fellow slave take them across the river from Kentucky into Indiana. They traveled by night and rested in the woods and the bushes during the day. It took about 2 weeks before they reached Cincinnati, Ohio, and their food was gone by then. His children were crying and complaining. Josiah took his chances and stopped at a place to purchase food for his family. However, the journey further north proved more difficult as they continued to run out of food and were tired from walking. They eventually met Indians who fed them, gave them a place to stay, gave them directions and supplies, and treated them with kindness. Josiah eventually ran into a captain who offered him work, and while Josiah was working, the man agreed to take him and his family to New York. The captain, a Scottish man, paid the ferry to take them into Canada and gave Josiah $1 when they parted. Josiah knew that the only way to truly be free was to leave the United States. So on October 28, 1930, he, his wife, and children arrived in Canada as free people. Josiah was about 41 years old. Josiah heard of a man who was hiring named Mr. Hibbard. The man allowed Josiah to stay in one of his houses where his pigs often stayed. Josiah managed to expel the pigs, and Josiah's family cleaned up the new house and they rested. Soon, his wife and all of his children fell sick, and they barely escaped with their lives. Josiah worked hard and was able to gain favor from the man he was working for. In addition, Josiah's wife and Mr. Hibbard's wife got along well. Mr. Hibbard paid for Josiah's son, Tom, to go to school for 2 quarters and learn how to read, and his teacher taught Tom a little longer on his own. Josiah would often have Tom read him the Bible so that Josiah could have something to preach about. One day, Tom asked Josiah about King David, but Josiah told him that he didn't know anything about him. Josiah was so ashamed when he admitted to his son that he could not read. Tom agreed to teach Josiah how to read, and although it took much longer than they both expected, and both did become frustrated, Josiah learned how to read a decent amount. He then realized how ignorant he was when he was a slave. Soon, Josiah became a part of a thriving Black community of free people, and the community was constantly growing. The community put their money together and rented land from a white man because they wanted to work for themselves and grow their own crops. They were eventually told that the government owned the land, so the man could not accept rental money for it. They sued the man, taking him to court to win their money back, but they lost. However, the next year, they won their appeal. Josiah staked that land out personally because it was fruitful. They decided they needed to purchase the land because if it was sold to someone else, all of their crops and hard work would be in vain. Through donations and saving, they were finally able to purchase the land. As Black people were escaping America and going to Canada, they were becoming a part of Black communities. Josiah noticed that the newly enslaved people who were coming to his community stood out like a sore thumb. They were like a red flag because many times they were content with these small amounts of pleasure. They would lease land and they would clear it so they could plant crops. But by the time they cleared the land, the lease was up. And the white farmers would then swoop in, plant their crops on this newly cleared land. And 10 years later, the Black people were no better off than they were before. And then other enslaved people would grow tobacco. It was rare that a white person knew how to grow tobacco or that they had the complete knowledge and understanding of how to grow tobacco. So tobacco was mostly grown by Black people. And Black people took advantage of this, and they wanted to make their money by growing and harvesting tobacco. But the problem was the market had too many people selling tobacco. So they needed to invest in a new crop. So Josiah encouraged them to invest in wheat and sell produce. Josiah would hold meetings discussing the issues he was seeing and explaining to the newest enslaved people they should not be content with the bare minimum. He gave them his ideas on how to grow their community, both in wealth and in numbers. He even went back to the South on occasion, helping to bring more slaves to freedom. He would also travel around the North, soliciting donations for the Black community. Josiah talked to the community members, and he persuaded them to create a school for their children. He said that slavery begins with the mind, and the hope of removing slavery from the mind was through education. They opened a school in Dawn, Canada, and in 1842, when he was about 53 years old, he moved and settled there, where the Black community owned 200 acres of land. As you can see, Josiah was a good man, and I don't want his reputation or his legacy to be tainted by lies. When Josiah concluded his slave narrative, this is what he said. I will conclude my narrative by simply recording my gratitude, heartfelt and inexpressible, to God and to many of my fellow men for the vast improvement in my condition, both physical and mental, for the great degree of comfort in which I am surrounded, for the good I have been enabled to effect, for the light which has risen upon me, for the religious privilege I enjoy and the religious hopes I am permitted to cherish, for the prospects opening to my children, so different from what they might have been, and finally, for the cheering expectation of benefiting not only the present, but many future generations of my race. Rest in peace, Uncle Josiah. Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. And please log on to my online bookstore, www.burksbooks.com, where you can purchase a copy of my Slaves narrative book. It has different slave narratives and also pictures of real African American slaves.